Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan and who I believe is now the undisputed most common Ether Hour guest, our good friend, Anthony of Westgate. We are here to discuss a few different things. Obviously, we know that our previous World War Now episode was almost 2.5 hours long. And if you would believe it, there are so many things we still didn't get to discuss, many of which having to do with the domestic American front. We didn't get into as many details into Trump's new territorial ambitions on the continent per se, as well as some more of the Elon Musk discourse. And in general, there's a lot of discourse about transhumanism, the future of the tech right, as, little tech as it's being called, takes over in America, has Trump's new donors, his new supporters. Even Mark Zuckerberg is apparently walking back the censorship regime on Facebook. So we're seeing huge cultural, geopolitical changes within the United States culturally that we're not always able to fit into the weekly World War III analysis. So we are going to explore some of those issues today, how a lot of people view Trump as this sort of Trojan horse for many globalist ideas that the average MAGA supporter, for example, would never have accepted under any different regime. So we're going to be discussing all of this, going to get into a bit of a more discussion on our ritual regicide, because Anthony himself has been reading it and has some of his own interesting thoughts as well. So we're going to dive right into that. Anthony, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, brothers. Always a pleasure to be on the Ether Hour, as usual, and looking forward to the discussion here.
No, I think it's going to be some good stuff, and I think we'll just dive right in. I want to start us off with some of these latest developments in Greenland with the Territorial discussions from Donald Trump about how he wants Canada, he wants Greenland, he wants the Panama Canal back. We're talking about, some pretty heavy stuff, which again, many people are saying this is just trolling, but the amount he's been talking about this, including since even his first term, specifically, I believe when it comes to Greenland, we can't just chalk it up to joking anymore. So just to set the stage, Donald Trump Jr., Charlie Kirk, of all people, touched down on one of the Trump planes in Greenland recently in the capital of Nuuk, which again, Greenland, less than 60,000 people. This capital city, I believe they've got maybe 20,000 in the overall area, probably less than that. So this is a very sparsely populated part of the world. But nonetheless, Trump has been talking about how it needs to become part of America, and the Greenlanders themselves have been talking about how they want independence from Denmark. And we did discuss this in the previous episode of World War Now, where we discussed how ultimately the United States has the resources to buy off effectively every individual citizen of Greenland. So the political reality of it becoming part of America isn't really that much of a question. But I think what everyone has now been discussing, well, one thing that happened that was funny is the Danish king updated the coat of arms of Denmark to basically reinforce their claim on Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And they removed the 3 crowns on the Danish coat of arms, which again is the Kalmar Union, which is a old kingdom claim of Iceland, parts of Greenland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, all as this kingdom. But I guess Denmark realized that's never coming back, so we should just try to hold on to what we have. But obviously, I know Dmitry has, I think the big obvious geopolitical implication here has to do with the United States' relationship with Russia, how Russia has obviously the largest share of control over land that is in the North Pole area, the Arctic Circle. So that is the big kind of arms race that's going on. Russia, we've talked about how much they are beating the United States in their, for example, tactical and military icebreakers. And this then ties into the fact that Trump is talking about having Canada as the 51st state and just totally annexing Canada, which is obviously making Canadian politicians not happy. But ultimately, if you look at the map, Canada, Greenland, if those come under the United States, then the United States has just as much access and control over the Arctic Circle, these northwestern passages, which as the ice around there melts, these become more and more viable trade routes that allow people to totally bypass the southern hemisphere and whatnot. So I think before we start talking about how this could be a Club of Rome, Morgenthau, globalist plan, Dmitry, perhaps I'd like your thoughts on some of the geopolitical implications of all this Greenland and Canada talk.
Yeah, of course. I mean, first and foremost, the Greenland discourse being pushed by Trump to Republicans, it's very 1776 reminiscent of the early Americans revolting against the concept of the European empire owning these colonial lands in the wars between America and the war for independence, technically speaking, and even the perspective of America going against, say, the Spanish Empire, fighting against Mexico, fighting against the British holdings in Canada and the Northern lands. It's all taken into consideration. So America expanding into a territory held by the King of Denmark in some ways is almost, and I'm not going to say it's a revolt against monarchy 2.0 of any sort, but it is in some ways exploitative of post-colonial international relations theory, which essentially, in summary, it's one of the biggest theories in international relations, which you can learn about in college and university if you do sort of invest time into that. But besides, of course, liberalism and realism, which is spoken about by Mearsheimer and Professor Alexander Dugin quite often, but post-colonial international relations theory especially focuses from the perspective of the post-colonial nations such as India, Bangladesh, for example, many African countries, even Middle Eastern countries in particular, focuses on the illegitimacy of the previous colonial rule by force and power of the imperial nation. Mind you, most of the time, the imperial nation in question is white European, essentially Indo-European. And so the focus is technically mixed in, the discourse is mixed in with an anti-Christian flavor because it's the Christians who are seen, and again, in this context, it would be Roman Catholics and Protestants as the evil colonial overlords who have dominated the land. So in some ways, stating openly that these previous European imperial powers did not legitimately occupy certain territories, geographical land masses, massive islands such as, for example, New Zealand, Australia, Hawaii, right? Hawaii, which also had its own Hawaiian kings and chieftains, but also Denmark in and of itself, now a very strategic, important landmass up there in the north, essentially, with the Arctic Circle, so important in future geopolitical considerations, especially when you think about the fact that Rosatom, the Russian nuclear company, the only Russian state-owned, by the way, it's 100% state-owned by the Russian Federation government. So essentially, Vladimir Putin has oversight over all Russian nuclear developments, including these massive nuclear icebreakers, which run on, essentially nuclear icebreakers run on infinite fuel. They never really run out. They never have to dock. They can always break ice and essentially explore those northern lands in the ICC. But the consideration with Rosatom is that it's the only state-owned Russian corporation which hasn't been sanctioned. So the 30,000 plus sanctions strategically have been placed on oil, gas companies, all these other various corporations and production companies in Russia and companies, Russian, of course, corporations and businesses which export goods, except Rosatom. Now, why would the globalists allow Russia to continue exporting nuclear technology to the world? Most likely for it to be developed further so that either this technology could be stolen or if it could be directly purchased through, of course, this false fiat currency from the Russians in the future, which again, because the Russians are in such economic strife at the moment due to the sanctions, they would most likely sell some of these nuclear technologies even to, unfortunately, these Western globalist countries in the first place. This is why Rosatom is unsanctioned. We covered this with our good friend Gennady on the lengthy 8th hour discussing BRICS and the Russian energy sector, which is one of our longest episodes on World War Now. But definitely go check it out if you're interested in sort of energy technology. But going back to post-colonialism, why it's important is because Trump could essentially utilize that same H-1B visa, bring in the Indians discourse to state that, well, look, we're a country that is post-colonial. The US has always opposed European empires. The only reason Greenland is part of the Danish crown, according to sovereignty, is because the Danish Empire, which was exploitative of various other natives in Africa, the Indian subcontinent, etc., and Southeast Asia, also exploited this unfortunate land of Greenland, which we need to liberate. This also can play into the context, potentially, the globalists will exploit the idea of liberating Greenland from these former monarchies as a way to push against any European monarchical revangism, which again, as we know, like speaking about the prophecies, we know that in Eastern Europe and countries such as Greece, maybe even if Greece reflourishes into a future potential Eastern Roman Empire again under St. John Vatatzis when he does awaken the Marble Emperor, or even if the Russian Federation becomes a newly reborn Russian Empire with its Tsar at its helm, this anti-monarchical, anti-imperial discourse, the fact that, well, most Christian countries in Europe and throughout New Testament history have developed through, again, imperial-style governance, it will be used against us as well, us Christians. So again, what's happening in Greenland, I think, is multifaceted. It brings in, again, these post-colonial, anti-imperial attitudes which are exploited and mobilized by the globalists against white people, generally speaking, in terms of their attitudes, by bringing in these Indians, Bangladeshi, international workers into the US. It also plays into favor of, again, America exploiting its geopolitical prowess in actually obtaining some of these very key strategic islands and sort of land which prior did not belong to it. So, and in some ways, again, Trump and the Republican deep state can always play this virtue signaling card that they're simply, again, expanding American interests, but not at the expense of the Europeans. They're simply bringing democracy, liberalism, and again, essentially the Pax Americana to the Danish, who need to be saved from their evil monarch and their evil old ways. In some ways, it's a re-1776ing of former European colonies, which unfortunately will be supported by libertarian types such as Alex Jones, I think inherently speaking, because these people have been conditioned to hate the idea of monarchy and hate the idea of these old European kings even controlling territory in the Americas in the first place.
Well, I think that one of the things you can learn from the Danish and Scandinavian monarchies in general is any monarchy that has largely been allowed to exist within the liberal system will sort of become a mockery of it. I mean, you have King Frederick and all these other clowns. I mean, they're like extremely liberal. You know, they marry off their kids to these foreigners. They try to push them. So even the royal family, you know, in the UK, you can see it everywhere. They're always trying to present as progressive. I mean, even Charles, who clearly has an affinity for a traditional religion, he has to couch it in, you know, Guianian perennialism. And of course, his high-level Freemasonry doesn't make that any better for the future of, you know, ecumenical religious relations. But I think the situation with what you just mentioned about how even these monarchies are going to be painted as regressive, the fact that these countries still have kings, that's going to be an easy way for people to be like, look, this is still, remember people like Leopold II and all this other fake history about how oppressive most European Christian rulers were, then that's going to be used as a pretext to expand what we now realize is largely a Club of Rome plan. And we might have to do a fuller deep dive on what the Club of Rome actually is, considering that they clearly have broader tentacles. And I'm not trying to implicate Calin Georgescu, the, you know, nationalist candidate in Romania, but he himself was a former member of the Club of Rome. And one of the things people online have been posting a lot about, and I was posting about, is the 10 Kingdoms map that is reportedly from the Club of Rome. And of course, anybody that has read the Milton William Cooper book, Behold a Pale Horse, that map is cited in that book as a sort of future idea for how the world will be divided by Zog, the New World Order, into these super regions, the 10 kingdoms they claim. And we'll probably have that map as part of the thumbnail so you can take a gander at that. But the idea being creating this sort of Hunger Games type world where there is, of course, a central one world government that is then administered over these specific regions. And I'm not saying there's going to be a Hunger Games, but clearly these super regions have been kind of deduced by the world elites to be how they want people to exist regionally and how they want it to be broken up culturally and all these sorts of things. And one of those parts of the map, Region 1, is all of North America, or rather United States, Canada, and Greenland, and potentially Mexico as well. And then you have these other parts with most of Africa, Russia holding most of Eastern Europe, all of South America being one of the regions. But the region that is Region 1, where I guess in theory the world capital could even be, Donald Trump is basically trying to restore that exactly with his current territorial endeavors, plus the Panama Canal, which is extremely unrealistic of all of the options he's talking about here. But I guess I want to throw this over to you, Anthony, with this sort of general idea about Donald Trump as, again, from my personal perspective, I support all the Greenland stuff just because it's interesting, just because Donald Trump is bringing back history. The post-war consensus has been that the current borders are how things are and we don't need to be annexing territory. And if you've heard any of the anti-Russia rhetoric from the EU, NATO people, it's all about their disruption of the post-war consensus. They're accusing them of this irredentism and all this sort of stuff. And Donald Trump, not even in office yet, is just openly talking about taking Canada, taking Greenland, taking the Panama Canal, all this stuff. And I support this return to history, you know, this total rebuke of Francis Fukuyama. But at the same time, that makes me very wary because now somebody like me, a very wary anti-globalist, an antichrist activist, as some could say, I'm supporting what could perhaps be a Trojan horse for a Club of Rome, globalist UN Morgenthau type plan that will bring in total Zog control. So, Anthony, I couldn't think of anybody better to throw this scenario to hear their thoughts.
Yeah, there's this discussion now, whether it's the right and Trump kind of memeing into existence this idea of expanding the U.S. territory into Canada. The fact is, the narrative itself is what is concerning to me, the fact that this is being discussed whether unironically or not, in relatively serious manner, and the implications of that. So whether this is possible or not to expand U.S. territories into Canada, you're looking at the expansion of the U.S. infrastructure. Whether there's some kind of separation politically and economically, it would be expanding the infrastructure itself. And when we think about the infrastructure, we're looking at the technocracy currently that's being established in the Trump administration. And this was one of the things that I was very wary of going into the election, was Elon's affiliation with the Trump party. And when we're looking at establishing and expanding this infrastructure, we're looking at expanding the technocracy that is currently underway. And so this is a thing that is being discussed in a serious manner. Just the fact that the narrative is leading towards this path, and there's no concern whatsoever over this expansion of the technocracy in a sense of the geographical expansion. That's what's concerning to me. I understand the historical perspective. I am kind of taking a wait and see approach because we all know that Trump is a lot of talk. There's been a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that people aren't noticing in regards to the technocracy that are, in my opinion, the most concerning parts. And I think a lot of this stuff is distracting from that part, whether it's intentional or not. All this kind of new memes and narrative that is being adopted by the right, and you see how they kind of will abandon their principles under a Trump administration. And I guess another concern more politically for me is that sounds great under Trump, but then what happens in 4 years? Like, we're not under a monarchy, we're under a democracy. And so how comfortable are you with this occurring under a democratic leadership, right? It's like you're going to have all this happening, and then you're expanding the U.S. territories, and that's just leading to more control over the liberal democracy. And so, and the funny part is, yeah, you're expanding the U.S. territory, and say it goes into Canada, we're now just acquiring more third world imports. It's not like you're expanding into native territories and Americanizing it. It's like, no, you're just acquiring more of this problem that we have of the borders.
Yeah, let's just annex Punjab next, why not?
Yeah. So like, yeah, we're just going to acquire this like millions of third world imports that we can't even solve this problem in our own existing borders. And so I just think that the whole discussion is ridiculous, whether it's serious or not. It's the fact that there's really no pushback from the hardcore Trump supporters. And I'm a little bit concerned with that going into this presidency, because he's almost like immune of criticism from the right. And my approach is just, I'll commend him when he does good things, but when he's doing things like that are more concerning, we should be able to express our concern without being accused of blackpilling and, all this like gaslighting that's been going on.
Yeah, I totally agree. Before I throw it to you, Dimitri, I just wanted to say, as far as where I kind of rank the realisticness of all of this, I think the Greenland thing is definitely possible because there's just such a small amount of people there, and Denmark is so politically subservient to the United States. But then the Canada stuff I find hilarious, because if there was a bet for this, which there isn't, I would totally be betting like Canada is going to break up before it ever like unilaterally joined the United States. And that would be much better for the United States. If the United States were to get any part of Canada, you want like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and maybe Yukon, and that's pretty much it. Because if not, all you're getting are Indians and Chinese and libtards. Like, that's literally all you'd be getting. So if I were an Americanist maximalist right now behind the scenes, Jack Reacher, I would be working to orchestrate the dissolution of Canada. I'd be boosting Quebec independence. I'd be leading white separatist movements in Alberta that are sick of the third world stuff. And then I'd probably be pushing Cascadia stuff out in British Columbia. So any anti-Canadian government activists, there's some lore and tips for you. But yeah, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on all this too.
There's always an inherent danger with the annexation of territory, not because the people whom you're taking under your care and into your sort of sovereign state and your sovereign sort of domain will be rebellious or maybe angry at you, right? And they may sort of rise up against you into the future, but also because they simply may have a different worldview and mindset civilizationally, culturally speaking. And what do we see in Canada? Well, we see the Canadian people largely made up of various sorts of immigrants, but originally of the Anglo-Saxon, even Franco-Saxon stock, right? So people, Celts, people from Western Europe, again, becoming very, shall we say, brainwashed by the liberal ideology. And over the last, I would say since World War II, Canada has very, unquestionably become hyper-liberal. In fact, more so than even other nations of the Commonwealth after the dissolution of the British Empire. So, of course, on their coins, they still have Elizabeth II. However, Canada in and of itself is still a holder of these hyper-liberal ideology, in some ways even more so than certain US states. So when Trump even memes about annexing countries such as, or even territories such as Greenland, on one hand, Greenland is quite safe, right? It's only a population of 50 plus thousand people. 99% of them are white Europeans, fairly civilized. It seems to be completely fine. There's no consideration of whether or not what will happen to the native Greenland population when they start receiving some of the gifts of Western capitalist exploitation, such as the H-1B workers, for example, which is like a big part of the recent discourse. You look at countries, we spoke about this in early 2024, Conrad, countries such as Guyana, for example. Guyana is a model of what the globalists will want the US to be like into the future. So the country of Guyana is 40% Indian. This is demographically speaking. 30% African, right? So that's the ethnic makeup. The rest are, of course, various other Asiatic European people. So that's the mixed meat, so to speak, right, of the pie. And now the religious makeup is even more interesting. 54% Christian. So these are various Protestant Catholic sects. 30% Hindu, right? Guyana is like the model of what the globalists would like Western countries to be like. Now, Guyana is a former, of course, former colony, similar to, again, Greenland as well. Now, Greenland, though, is 99% white, Christian, European. And the only question is, like, how will Greenland transform under, say, an American sort of, as an American state or an American territory? My guess is it will become worse. It'll actually be worse for the actual people there, the locals. They'll sort of experience real American cultural enrichment. And I don't mean through McDonald's and other major sort of technological expansion points, right? Which we joke about when we speak about the dissolution of the USSR, that like, well, the Russians and the post-Soviets only wanted these American goods to be provided to them and these sort of food technologies, right? Which, again, most likely this is what the normies wanted. But again, the technocrats always wanted more of those control levers that the American elites had in the first place, which is what they actually inherited in the first place, right? So financial control, central banking, etc. But the Danish people themselves, how will they benefit? How will the people of Greenland benefit? These are all very open questions. There's a lot of consideration as well as to if America does, for example, expand into Canada, who will it be bringing over? Who will be voting for American elections? Mostly liberals. Just consider the fact that Jordan B. Peterson himself, despite his popularity, he's very normie conservative, despite his popularity in Canada,
you will never be American, Jordan Peterson.
Well, here's the fact, Conrad. He was ostracized in his own country because his views, which are very center-right and not far-right by any stretch of the imagination, were seen as too radical. So who exactly will America be bringing in to its sphere of influence, into its politics, into the voting bloc, into the voting base? Essentially liberal post-Europeans in the form of Canadians. No offense to conservative Canadians, but Canada is one of the most liberal, shall we say, post-colonial nations in the world, with some of the most regressive laws, and they've continuously voted in hyper-liberal governance. So in many ways, it's almost like a good example historically, a great analogy again, is the Russian Empire during the reign of Catherine the Great, Catherine II, in the 1700s, who again annexed, alongside Prussia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, divided Poland and annexed many Polish Roman Catholics, many of whom were very liberalized, especially post-French Revolution. They had many, shall we say, hyper-liberal Republican ideas because Poland was always the hotbed of philo-Semitic, democratic, Republican attitudes. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is not an example of a based Roman Catholic monarchy by any stretch of the imagination. And any Roman Catholic conservative who thinks so really needs to have some introspection as to exactly what their good idea of monarchy or conservative governance is. But the Russian Empire inherited all of those peoples. Sure, they had wealth, they could invest into the empire, they could spend their money and circulate a lot of capital, shall we say, in an economic sense. But They inherited many Jewish people, many people of the Talmudic kind, and even Roman Catholics who were, shall we say, already infused with all these negative ideologies from the West and from Central Europe, which, again, only brought extra problems to the Russian Empire. And yeah, sure, there's geopolitical strength that Russia gained by having this massive buffer state between itself and Germany and Prussia. But in the end, was it worth it? Many Russian Slavophiles and conservatives, I would say even Professor Alexander Dugin will probably say, in the end, we wish that Catherine the Great never annexed Poland in the first place, or any even part of Poland, because it brought so many issues to even Western Ukraine and all those regions that we're still kind of digesting today, as we can see in the Russo-Ukrainian special military operation and the war that's happening in Eastern Europe today, because that corruption really spread all across even natively Russian regions. And it's the same issue that will take place if Trump really attempts to say, either build, as you said, Conrad, this block, this united block of control that the globalists planned for North Americas, or perhaps even conjoin America and Canada in any way. Because what can the Canadians really bring to the American people who are somewhat, maybe theoretically awakening and beginning to notice certain trends in world affairs? The Canadians are certainly not noticing as much as the Americans are.
Well, I think in many ways, the Canadians will just have to do what the Americans and then perhaps some of their elites ultimately decide. But like I said, I think there's a chance that Canada, they've replaced themselves demographically and enacted so much terrible policy that the idea of a united Canada, I think, might no longer be something that God smiles upon. So we may be in for that at some point. But I want to return to what Anthony was saying about Elon Musk specifically and about the technocracy rising right now. We talked about the H-1B debacle on the show where Elon Musk had a hissy fit and decided to just ban people that disagreed with him on politics, on things that would affect his bottom line, which of course is the immediate issues that all these rich billionaires and Peter Thiel types, PayPal mafia, the Palantir gang, and all these others are totally infiltrating the Trump administration. And people have talked about how obviously Trump, 60+% of his donations in his first term were small dollar, and now they're less than 40%. Rumors say Elon Musk spent $300 million to bankroll the campaign. Of course, we got the $100 million from Miriam Adelson, with West Bank annexation sort of attached as the price tag there, the political pay for play. We've got Zuckerberg, Tim Apple, Tim Cook himself, Bezos, all given $1 million to the inauguration, giving their pinch of incense, as it were, to the emperor. So I guess amidst all of this reshuffle, Anthony, I'm asking, what should our biggest concern be about these characters and their infiltration of our government, our foreign policy, our relations with all these other countries and whatnot? I'm wondering what you think we should be paying the most attention to.
Well, probably their affiliation with, there's no other way to say this besides just come out and say it, but their affiliation with the occult. There is a very dark objective to what they're doing, and most people are blind to it because they're just adopting these technologies, and actually most people aren't even consciously adopting them. So for example, on X is essentially an AI platform now, and it has been for a while, but now it's just obviously more integrated. And the way that everyone's using Grok as part of the platform, how integrated it is with the platform, and how people are leaving the platform over the censorship. And not that that's not a valid reason to leave the platform, but they're more concerned with that than the fact that every behavior and every word that they're engaging with and posting on the platform is feeding this AI. And that's not a concern at all. In fact, everyone's just continuing to use it and inquire to this AI as if it's a source of truth. And that is, I think, the most concerning part for me, is how there's no awareness to any of this. And we're just using it as it's being thrusted upon us and almost being forced to use it by manipulating our usage of current technologies. Now everything, it's not even an update. It's not even like you opt in for an update to get AI and you can opt out of it. It's just being overnight, like a light switch turns on, and now, hey, everything's AI. Everyone's using it like this toy. And that's kind of the direction things are heading in now. And like I was saying with the occult part, we have seen that recently there was kind of an expose on Elon, and there was a lot of talk of him having this alt account that everyone's aware of as Adrian Dittman, which there's been a lot of discourse about if that's really him or not. There was a few convincing posts that I guess they convinced me at least that it's not him. And behind the scenes, there was this expose on 4chan of him having this very deeply esoteric account where he's kind of like it's a Smurf account where he's LARPing as the Antichrist. And the name of the handle is named 666. And so there's this post on 4chan. Again, I know this is 4chan and take it for what it is. There could obviously be a troll or something, but there's been pretty extensive research on this, or at least deep dives in the 4chan sense. So there was a post this was back in July of last year, where it's mentioning the user saying, my Smurf account named 666 is growing pretty fast considering I've only been using it for a week, trying to see how popular I would be if I were not Elon Musk, using the most blasphemous and off-putting name possible. Other niche accounts that are fire and experiencing tremendous growth. And then he names all these other like accelerationist accounts that are pretty influential on the platform and suggesting to boost them and be, affiliated with them, look out for them and stuff because they're kind of pushing this narrative. And this narrative of accelerationism is also something that's just really not enough attention being paid to it because it's completely Antichrist. The idea in a nutshell is to accelerate technology beyond human capabilities of being able to control it. And this is what Elon is. This is Elon's ideology. He doesn't come out and say he's an accelerationist, but he's using all of this language that it's obvious, and he's associated with all these other accelerationist accounts. One of them, Mark Andreessen. So there's a lot of these accounts that are kind of flying under the radar, and unless you're really paying attention, you wouldn't even know. You wouldn't even make anything of it. You'd just say, okay, these are like futurists or whatever.
It's a human instrumentality project, man. They want to turn us all into orange Fanta.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the most, I guess, obvious thing that more people are aware of is his push for this colonization of Mars, like the space travel stuff. He's saying, I want to fly past the moon. The moon is not really an attainable thing. I want to go straight to Mars and everyone's going to become Martians and everything. He's talking about the philosophy that will be established once they colonize Mars. Again, this is all seemingly very unserious and, as we know, probably even impossible. But again, it's the narrative. It's the narrative that this is now becoming embedded in the ideology of the right. And he's like perceived as like our guy and everything. It's just, and I know people are kind of turning on him, but they're turning on him for the wrong reasons. They're turning on him because of the H-1B1 censorship and not because of his Antichrist tendencies, I suppose. So this is something that I have been kind of aware of for a while, and I'm not really seeing much spread of this darker part of this whole thing happening. It's more of the political part and censorship and all this, but no one's really paying attention to the fact that this is someone who's very aware of the esoteric integration of technology. And he's even said it before in previous posts that I was able to dig up, where he's talking about how magic and technology are inseparable. These things are not just these spur of the moment thoughts. You look at his alt account again, and it's like he's very aware of this stuff. He's not leading on to it, but if that's really him, which I am very convinced that this is his alt account, I don't think it's that far-fetched to imagine that Elon has a Smurf account where he's kind of embracing this identity that people have been attributing to him and running with it just as an experiment. But whether it's serious or not, he has the knowledge and awareness of the occult to some extent.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of this Ether Hour episode. I consider one of these, Ether Hour unplugged. It's just, we had some stuff to talk about with the crazy Elon, Greenland, Club of Rome, transhumanism stuff. We had Anthony on and we just dove right at it. So be sure to get behind the paywall. You'll hear some really deep discussions on our perspectives on the transhuman future, the tech bros, the PayPal mafia, everything that they have been planning. We go into some details about how we think people should be resisting the Antichrist and these other issues. So be sure to check it out. I think a lot of people that enjoy our content, you're really going to like this full episode. So be sure to check it out. It supports the show. You get access to all 60 plus episodes of Ether Hour if you get behind the paywall, as well as our Q&A threads, which we will have a Q&A episode coming up soon. So get behind the paywall, ask us your questions, get hours and hours and hours of content, and of course, support our endeavors here at World War Now. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the other side. God bless.